Welcome back to Two Hearts, where stories are weaved to explore the beauty of diverse cultures and the depths of human connection. When a brilliant but underestimated librarian reinvents herself on a sun-drenched vacation escape, the last thing she expects is to fall for a dangerously captivating stranger with secrets of his own. He's not who he says he is. She's not the woman she claims to be. But under moonlight celebrations, intoxicating traditions, and a festival neither of them understands until it's too late, their carefully crafted lies begin to unravel. Follow Emory and Alexander as they navigate a seductive high-stakes romance full of hidden identities, unkept promises, and the effects of what happens when two broken people discover that the one place they feel most seen is in each other's arms. Please enjoy Duplicity, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that more members of our community continue to find content like this.
Dr. Emory Thompson stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Gone were the thick-framed glasses and comfortable cardigans she wore daily as a university librarian. In their place stood a poised woman in a designer sundress with perfectly styled hair and makeup that accentuated her high cheekbones and smooth, russet complexion. "Boss babe," she whispered to herself, testing the words that had become her armor over the past several months. "You can do this." The transformation hadn't been easy. For 31 years, Emory had been content with her quiet life, surrounded by books and the predictable rhythm of academic semesters. She'd found joy in the scent of old paper and the satisfaction of helping students expand their knowledge. But 6 months ago, everything had changed. It had started with Mark, well before the cheating, before the humiliation that still tightened her throat if she let herself linger on it. They'd met 2 years prior at a campus reception for new faculty and staff. Emory had been standing near the refreshment table, half listening to a conversation about budget cuts, when Mark drifted to her side and joked about the stale pastries like she was a co-conspirator in his refreshment table surveillance. He was charming in an easy, practiced way, handsome, quick with attention, and impressed by her in a way that felt like sunlight after too many winters of being overlooked. At first, dating him felt like being chosen. He'd bring coffee during finals week, slip notes into her tote bag, and call her Doc with a pride that made her laugh. But slowly, his compliments started to come with instructions. "You'd be unstoppable if you dressed a little sharper. Those glasses hide your face. You're too quiet at dinners. People assume you don't have opinions." He framed it as support, as polishing a diamond. And because Emory loved him, and because a small, old insecurity recognized the shape of his critique, she started trying. A different blouse, contacts once in a while, lip gloss before a faculty mixer. Each change earned her a kiss, a pleased look, the sense that she'd passed a test she hadn't agreed to take. 2 weeks after that dinner, she'd gone down to the university archives late, looking for a misfiled box of 19th century newspapers for a professor who'd begged her for a miracle. The basement corridors were quiet, the air cool and stale. Light spilled from the records room ahead, and she smiled, relieved to find someone still working, until she recognized Mark's laugh. Not his polite public laugh, his private one, he saved for when he felt emboldened and powerful. She stopped just outside the doorway. Mark was inside with a graduate student from the business school named Jade. Sleek black hair, a fitted blazer, heels that clicked with confidence. Jade's hand was on Mark's chest. His was on her waist. She heard her own name said like an inconvenience. "She's brilliant," Mark murmured, as if that softened the cruelty. "But she doesn't know how to present. I can't keep dragging her into rooms where perception decides everything." The young woman laughed, low and satisfied. Emory's stomach turned, not only at what she was seeing, but at the way his words turned her into a problem he could solve by replacing her. When she confronted him, Mark didn't even deny it. He just sighed like she'd interrupted a meeting. "Emory, don't be melodramatic," he said, reaching out and adjusting her collar as though she was the mess. "I need a partner who fits, someone who can stand beside me at faculty functions and donor dinners without appearing uninterested. I'm trying to get tenured. I can't afford to not look the part." The breakup was brutal, but the aftermath was worse. Emory had retreated into herself, skipping social events and hiding behind her work, until even the library, the place that had always steadied her, felt like it was echoing with Mark's verdict. That's when Alana showed up, because Alana always showed up. Her younger sister breezed into Emory's apartment on a Tuesday night in a cropped leather jacket and red lipstick, contrasting beautifully against her brown skin, carrying takeout like an offering and her opinions like weapons. Alana worked as a personal stylist and image consultant, the kind of woman who could look at a stranger and know in 10 seconds what cut of jeans would change her posture. She was all bold angles and bright laughter, a walking rebuttal to anyone who'd ever made Emory feel invisible. She didn't let Emory spiral. She listened, eyes narrowing, jaw set, then said, "Okay, we're not going to let one mediocre man rewrite your whole sense of self." Alana reached across the table, squeezed Emory's hand, and softened just a fraction. "But if you want to try something new, if you want to see what it feels like to take up space, I can help. Not because you're not enough, but because you deserve to know you can be many things." A few nights later, still raw and restless, Emory found herself scrolling travel sites the way some people scrolled social media, looking for a life that didn't feel like hers. A brochure image of Cyprus stopped her cold. Turquoise water, sunlit stone streets, and a promise of anonymity in a place that looked like it knew how to celebrate being alive. 3 weeks, Emory whispered. Not forever, just long enough to breathe without Mark's voice in her ear. On impulse, and with Alana egging her on from the couch like a glamorous hype woman, Emory booked a 3-week vacation for the end of term.
Thus, Evie Thompson was born, a successful marketing consultant who spoke 3 languages and traveled the world closing deals. Emory built the lie like a research project, marketing podcasts on her commute, late-night articles on trends and terminology, YouTube videos on confident posture and small talk. But the polish came from Alana. She raided Emory's closet with theatrical disgust, then replaced it piece by piece. Tailored sundresses, linen sets, jewelry that caught light instead of apologizing for it. She taught Emory how to walk in sandals like they were a decision, how to enter a room without shrinking, how to smile like she was in on the joke. Rule 1, Alana said, pinning a strand of Emory's hair back with a satisfied hum. If Evie isn't the center of his attention, it's because he likes men. The resort was everything Emory could have hoped for. As she stood in her resort room overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The next 3 weeks would be her chance to live as someone else, someone admired and desired rather than overlooked and underestimated. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. "Alana, send me a pic right now. I need to approve this debut." Emory huffed a laugh and snapped a quick mirror selfie before she could talk herself out of it. The reply came instantly. "Yes, that's my sister." Another bubble followed. "Remember, shoulders back, chin up. If anyone tries to make you smaller, you take up more space. And do not let some raggedy vacation man talk you out of dessert." Emory's chest loosened, warmth spreading through her ribs. She typed back, "Thanks, I'm scared." "Alana, good. Do it scared. Evie doesn't ask for permission. Emory doesn't either." With one last glance at her reflection, Emory grabbed her designer handbag and headed for the door. Evie Thompson is ready for her debut, she told herself, her voice stronger now. Let the adventure begin. Alexander Strickland adjusted his sunglasses as he stepped onto the balcony of his suite, the vibrant streets of Limassol bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the sterile environment he usually inhabited as CEO of Strickland Global. "Relax, Alex," he murmured to himself, focusing on the breathing techniques his therapist had taught him. "You're on vacation. No board meetings, no shareholders, no pressure." But pressure was exactly what had brought him here. 3 weeks ago, during a crucial board meeting to discuss a hostile takeover bid, Alexander had experienced his worst panic attack yet. One moment, he'd been confidently presenting his defense strategy. The next, he'd found himself on the floor, paramedics hovering over him, while his board members looked on with a mixture of apprehension and calculation.
"The board is concerned, Alex," his doctor and friend Mitchell Scott had told him afterward. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high, and these blackouts during panic attacks, they're a liability. I'm sure you've already heard the rumors. Either you take a medical leave of at least 3 weeks, or they're prepared to vote you out." The ultimatum had stung. Alexander Strickland didn't do weakness. He'd built his company from the ground up, turning his father's modest real estate business into a global conglomerate worth billions. He was known in business circles as ruthless, decisive, and unflappable, qualities that now seemed to be deserting him when he needed them most. What frustrated him most was that he couldn't identify any conscious fear or anxiety. His life was in order, his business was thriving despite the takeover attempt, and he had no personal problems to speak of. Yet his nervous system continued to betray him, responding to some invisible threat with increasing frequency and intensity. "Your body remembers what your mind has suppressed," his therapist had suggested during their last session. "Sometimes trauma manifests physically, even when we believe we've moved past it." Alexander dismissed the notion. He'd grown up privileged, yes, but privilege didn't always mean safety. There had been something he'd never let himself name, something he'd filed away as the collateral cost of ambition and locked behind the same steel discipline he used on everyone else. When Alexander was 10, his father took him along to meet with a man named Graham Kessler after hours, his father's former business partner, the one who'd helped turn Strickland Real Estate from a local outfit into something investors took seriously. "Just to see how grown men negotiate," his father had said. Alexander believed they were walking into a safe space because Kessler was always kind to him and had attended several Sunday dinners at their home. He'd even held young Alexander's shoulder like a proud uncle and declared that he'd do great things one day. But that meeting hadn't been a negotiation. It had been an ambush dressed in familiarity. Kessler poured his father a drink, spoke softly about ambition and the necessity of modernity in business, then slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a draft agreement that would hand Kessler controlling interest of the company, paperwork written with the confidence of someone who already believed he'd won. When his father balked, Kessler's smile didn't change. He simply slid a photograph across the table. Alexander leaving school, backpack slung over one shoulder, unaware he'd been followed. "You always prioritized your family over the business," Kessler murmured, like it was a stated fact. "Sign tonight, and I'll make sure nothing unfortunate ever happens on his walk home. Refuse, and we'll all learn what you're really willing to lose." His father signed. Later, in the car, his hands shook so violently he could barely turn the key. He told Alexander to forget it, to never mention Kessler's name again, to be stronger than fear. And Alexander did what he was trained to do. He swallowed the terror whole and turned it into fuel, filing the moment away for a future he didn't yet know he was already building. He didn't understand all the words at 10, not the legal language, not the mechanics of controlling interest, but he understood the look on his father's face when they drove away, like a man had just been robbed in broad daylight and been forced to thank the thief for it. And Alexander understood something else, too. Kessler hadn't just cheated.
He'd taken pleasure in the leverage, in the intimacy of it, in knowing he could reach into their home and rearrange the Stricklands' lives with a single sheet of paper. Years later, when his father's health rapidly began to fail, Alexander found the truth the way he found everything else, by digging until the lie ran out of places to hide. A mislabeled folder in the home office, old shareholder agreements marked in red ink, a trail of side letters and temporary proxies that were never meant to be temporary. Graham Kessler hadn't just coerced one signature. He'd spent a decade quietly siphoning power, buying up minority stakes through shell entities, placing loyalists in quiet roles, arranging debt covenants that tightened around Strickland real estate like wire. The company hadn't been growing into a partnership, it had been shrinking into a trap. When the time came, Alexander didn't ambush him in a parking garage or trade threats in the dark. He did it in daylight, in a conference room with glass walls and witnesses, because that was the point. He slid Kessler the evidence, the amended cap table, the notice of breach, the board resolutions stripping him of authority. "You taught my father that signatures can be weapons," Alexander said, voice calm. Kessler's face went slack with disbelief, then mottled with rage. He threatened lawsuits, smear campaigns, ruin. Alexander listened to Kessler the way he had at 10, patient, still, certain. Then he smiled, small, sharp, involuntary, because it felt good, because justice, delivered cleanly, could look a lot like cruelty. Within months, Kessler's lenders called their notes. His reputation collapsed under regulatory scrutiny Alexander had tipped into motion with the lightest touch. The man who once held a child's photo like a knife left New York with nothing but a briefcase and a headline about fraud. And Alexander, newly in control of his father's company, newly fluent in bloodless brutality, became the magnet people warned each other about in boardrooms across oceans.
But his body never forgot. In adulthood, the attacks didn't come when he was scared. They came when he was confronted. Closed-door meetings, attempted takeovers, any moment where men in suits watched him the way Kessler had, quiet, patient, certain they already owned him. The trigger wasn't the deal, it was the sensation of being ambushed in a room where a signature could cost blood. His mind stayed sharp, reciting numbers and strategy, but his nervous system lit up like a fire alarm, vision tunneling, hearing warping, heart slamming against his ribs. The blackouts were his brain's brutal mercy, a forced shutoff, a hard cutaway from the moment his 10-year-old self had never been allowed to escape. Still, Alexander couldn't let his body's method of self-preservation be the thing that unraveled his hard-won empire. He'd chosen Cyprus for its reputation as a playground for the wealthy who valued discretion. Unlike Las Vegas or Monaco, places that broadcast their excesses to the world, the Mediterranean island catered to those who preferred their indulgences private. Here, Alexander hoped to find the peace his doctor insisted he needed to recalibrate his nervous system. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Room service, Mr. Stone," a cheerful voice called out. Alexander opened the door to find a resort employee holding a tray with a caravan of what appeared to be local wine and 2 small glasses. "Compliments of the resort management," the young man with the name tag Geo explained. "A traditional Cypriot welcome, a special Commandaria wine we make right here on the resort to help you settle in." Alexander forced a smile. "Thank you, that's very kind." As the employee departed, Alexander examined the wine, its deep amber color catching the sunlight. He wasn't much of a drinker, but perhaps a glass would help him relax. After all, he was supposed to be on vacation. Pouring himself a small amount, he took a sip and was surprised by its sweetness, almost like honey, with hints of nuts and dried fruit. It was smoother than he expected,
and he found himself pouring another glass before heading to the balcony to watch the sunset. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in russet swirls, Alexander felt his shoulders begin to relax for the first time in months. Maybe this vacation wouldn't be so bad after all. Evie, adjusted her designer shades as she settled into a lounge chair by the resort pool. The Mediterranean sun warmed her skin, and for the first time since arriving yesterday, she felt herself beginning to relax into her new persona. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Evie looked up to find herself staring at the most handsome man she'd ever seen. Tall, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist, he had dark hair that fell in waves across his forehead and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through her, or rather, through her disguise. "Not at all," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Please." As he sat down, Evie noticed the slight tension in his jaw and the way his eyes darted around the pool area, as if assessing potential threats. It was an odd contrast to his relaxed vacation attire of swim trunks and a simple t-shirt. "Aaron Stone," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but not overpowering. "Evie Thompson," she replied, trying to sound as confident as she imagined a successful marketing consultant would be. "Nice to meet you, Aaron." Their conversation started slowly, with the usual politeness about their respective homes and how they were enjoying Cyprus so far. Evie was careful to stick to the backstory she'd prepared. A St. Louis native who worked in international marketing and traveled frequently for business. "I'm an accountant," he said, when she asked about his profession. "Based in New York. I needed a break from tax season." Evie nodded, though she found it hard to reconcile his rugged good looks with the stereotypical image of a number cruncher. There was something about him, an intensity beneath his calm demeanor, that suggested he was more than he appeared. "What brings you to Cyprus?" he asked, turning the conversation back to her. "Business and pleasure," Evie replied smoothly, falling into her rehearsed role. "I have a client in the region, but I decided to extend my stay for some relaxation." As they talked, Evie found herself genuinely enjoying his company. Unlike most men she encountered, Aaron seemed more interested in her thoughts than her appearance, asking intelligent questions about marketing trends and international business. She had to draw on all her research to maintain her facade, but the challenge was exhilarating. They were interrupted by a resort employee approaching with a tray of colorful drinks. "Complimentary cocktails from the bar," he announced cheerfully. "Our signature Aphrodite's Delight. It's a local favorite." The drinks were a vibrant pink with exotic fruits and flowers as garnish. Evie accepted one gratefully, while Aaron hesitated for a moment before taking his.
"To new acquaintances," Aaron said, raising his glass. "And to Cyprus." "To Cyprus," Evie echoed, clinking his glass before taking a sip. The drink was delicious, sweet but not cloying, with an underlying warmth that spread through her body. She found herself taking larger sips than usual, the alcohol helping to dissolve the last of her nervousness about maintaining her disguise. As the afternoon wore on, they moved from the pool to the resort's outdoor restaurant, continuing their conversation over platters of meze, traditional Cypriot small plates, that included everything from grilled halloumi to stuffed grape leaves. With each dish that arrived, so did another round of cocktails. By the time the sun began to set, Evie felt pleasantly relaxed, her usual inhibitions melting away under the influence of the libations and Aaron's attentive company. She found herself laughing more freely, sharing stories about her business adventures that felt increasingly real the more she told them. Aaron, too, seemed to be loosening up, the tension in his shoulders gradually disappearing as they talked. He shared amusing anecdotes about his accounting firm and even confessed to a secret love for classical music, a detail that surprised Evie,
yet somehow made him more human. As evening descended, the resort staff lit torches around the restaurant, creating a romantic atmosphere that made Evie's heart beat a little faster. She was acutely aware of Aaron's proximity, the way his arm brushed against hers as they reached for the same dish, the intensity of his gaze when their eyes met across the table. "You know," he said suddenly, his voice lower than before, "I haven't felt this relaxed in months." "Me neither," Evie admitted, surprised by her honesty. "It's nice to just be, without worrying about impressing anyone." "Is that what you usually do?" Aaron asked, his curiosity genuine. "Worry about impressing people?" Evie hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of his question. "Sometimes," she finally admitted, "in my line of work, perception matters." "I can relate," Aaron said, though his expression suggested his reasons might be different from hers. The vulnerability in his voice caught Evie off guard. She'd expected arrogance from a man who looked like him, not this hint of something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Before she could respond, the resort employee approached their table again. "Mr. Stone, Miss Thompson," he said with a deferential nod, "the resort management would like to invite you to a special event tomorrow evening. The Festival of the Two Kingdoms is one of our most important annual celebrations, and we'd be honored if you would attend as our guests." Aaron and Evie exchanged glances, both clearly intrigued. "The Festival of the Two Kingdoms?" Evie repeated. "A reenactment of a legendary peace treaty between two ancient realms. Very poignant. The highlight is a symbolic rite between representatives of the two kingdoms, followed by a feast and celebration that lasts until dawn." "It sounds fascinating," Aaron said, though Evie noticed the slight tightening of his jaw at the mention of the ceremony. He had come to Cyprus to get away from the crowds, not get swept up into one. "We would be delighted to attend," Evie replied, before Aaron could decline. "Thank you for the invitation." As the employee departed, Aaron turned to her with a questioning look. "Are you really interested in some ancient ceremony?" The librarian in her, the student of history, was bursting at the seams with excitement, but Evie tamped Emory down before responding. "Why not?" Evie countered. "Isn't that what vacations are for? Experiencing new things?" Aaron studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You're right. I could use some new experiences." Evie's heart fluttered at his smile, and she took another sip of her cocktail to steady herself. Tomorrow's festival promised to be interesting, perhaps more interesting than she had anticipated when she'd booked this vacation. The next evening found Evie standing before her resort mirror, once again transforming herself, this time into a woman worthy of attending a legendary festival. She'd chosen a flowing blush jumpsuit that draped elegantly over her curves, its simplicity offset by gold jewelry that caught the light with every movement. "You look beautiful," Aaron said when he arrived to escort her. He'd traded his casual vacation wear for tailored linen pants and a crisp white shirt that highlighted his tan and muscular build.
Evie felt an embarrassed stain rising on her cheeks. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Stone." The festival was being held in a nearby village, and as they approached in the resort's provided transportation, the night itself seemed to change texture. Music threaded through the air like a living thing. Torchlight dotted the hillside in a wavering constellation. When the shuttle rounded the last bend, the square below opened up in a spill of light and sound, and Evie's anticipation tightened into a bright, happy ache. The village square had been transformed into a theater with no walls. Long tables formed a wide ring around a central stage, draped in embroidered cloths and crowded with platters, juicy olives, roasted lamb, citrus-slick salads, warm bread torn by hand, and bowls of honeyed sweets dusted in nuts. Ribbons looped between balconies and olive trees, garlands of white flowers and greenery softened the stone. Everywhere, hands offered something: a cup, a bite, a laugh, a tug at the wrist to pull them closer to the heart of the celebration. "This is incredible," Evie said, her eyes wide with wonder as they took in the scene. "More than I expected," Aaron agreed, though she noticed his gaze scanning the area as if assessing something. They were greeted by a gray-haired man in elaborate robes named Nicholas Hesperos, who introduced himself as the village elder. "Welcome, honored guests," he said, his voice resonant with authority. "Tonight you will witness the reenactment of the Great Treaty, a moment when two warring kingdoms became one through truce and ceremony." As they were led to their seats near the stage, Evie felt a thrill of excitement. This was exactly the kind of immersive experience she'd hoped for when planning her vacation. The ceremony began with a drumbeat that seemed to echo off the old stone and straight into Evie's ribs. Actors swept onto the stage in layered fabrics and metalwork that flashed in torchlight. Two banners unfurled, one crimson, one blue, and the crowd responded like a chorus, calling lines back, stomping in rhythm, laughing at familiar jokes. It wasn't a quiet audience. It was a village remembering itself aloud. As the story reached its climax, a fresh round of drinks arrived without being ordered, set down with ceremonial seriousness. The liquid in Evie's cup was golden and fragrant, sweet on the first sip, and then strangely warming, as if it carried sunlight and spice directly into her bloodstream. Between the courses, locals pressed small bites into their hands: candied citrus peel, cheese drizzled in syrup, something herbal and green wrapped in pastry. Evie felt her thoughts soften at the edges, the way a developing photograph blurred when breathed on. Aaron's usual vigilance dulled into something warmer. He still watched the crowd, old habits, but his shoulders had dropped, his laughter coming easier, his smile staying longer. When a dancer spun past and flicked a ribbon at his wrist, he didn't flinch. He caught it and bowed, to the crowd's delight. Evie watched him like he was a new version of himself being unveiled, one she couldn't help wanting closer. Evie leaned close to Aaron, eyes bright and unfocused in the pleasant way the night kept gifting her. "This is the part where they unite the kingdoms," she whispered, as if she were sharing a delicious secret only he deserved. "They're going to do the oaths." Before Aaron could respond, Evie was on her feet, too quick, too brave, glass raised like a microphone. "Let us do it," she called, laughing as if the idea was obviously perfect. For half a second, the square went still, the actors pausing mid-gesture. Then the crowd broke, delighted, cheers rolling forward, hands clapping, voices chanting encouragement in Greek. Aaron stared at her like she'd just jumped off a cliff and expected him to fly after her. And then, because whatever was in the wine loosened the knot he lived with, he stood too, lifted his hands in surrender to the moment, and followed. They pushed through the aisle and practically bounded up the steps to the stage. Evie's blush jumpsuit floated around her legs like a banner. Aaron's grin, rare, unguarded, earned another roar from the square. The actors broke character with delighted shock.
Nicholas blinked once, then spread his arms as if welcoming fate itself. "Our guests wish to honor the treaty," he boomed. The locals erupted, clapping in time to the drums as if this were the most wonderful disruption the festival had ever seen. The elder's eyes twinkled as he leaned toward them, as if letting them in on a joke the whole village already knew. "It is tradition," he said, voice carrying to the crowd, "that visitors may choose to represent the two kingdoms in the closing rite. It brings good fortune to all, especially when the guests come with brave hearts and loud voices." Hands reached for them at once, warm, efficient, celebratory. Someone swung a crimson cloak over Evie's shoulders, another settled royal blue across Aaron's back. The fabric was heavy, ceremonial, smelling faintly of incense and summer. The crowd cheered louder as the colors snapped into place. like the square had been waiting all night for the pair to complete the picture. "We're really doing this," Aaron murmured, amusement and disbelief interlaced in his voice. Evie squeezed his hand, fearless in a way she never was at home. "We insisted," she whispered, smiling up at him. The ceremony itself became a bright collage of sound and touch. Nicholas guided them through phrases in Greek that Evie repeated by shape rather than meaning, her tongue clumsy but eager. At certain lines, the crowd answered like a choir. Incense curled up from a brazier at the edge of the stage, mixing with roasted citrus and smoke from the torches. When Aaron spoke his part, his voice fell into a lower register that made Evie's stomach flutter, steady, sure, as if he'd been born for declarations. When it came time to exchange tokens, they were given matching woven bracelets, tight, intricate, threaded with the same crimson and blue as the banners. The elder wrapped Evie's wrist in Aaron's hand and guided the bracelet over her skin with a practiced tug, then did the same for Aaron, pressing the knot with his thumb like a seal. The crowd roared at the final gesture, two hands raised together, bracelets flashing in torchlight, and the drums shifted, not solemn anymore, but celebratory, pulling the square from ritual into revel. "We did it," Evie said with a laugh, as they were led from the stage to a special table laden with food and wine. "That was actually kind of fun." Aaron managed to smile, though she could see the tension still lingering around his eyes. It was an experience. The feast that followed was spectacular, course after course of traditional Cypriot dishes, accompanied by endless rounds of wine and festive beverages. The alcohol flowed freely, but Evie found herself favoring the homemade fruit drinks, the sweet, fruity concoction of aged grapes and peaches that went down easily. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly festive. Dancers pulled them from their seats and into the celebration, teaching them traditional steps that had them both laughing breathlessly. The boundaries between performers and guests blurred until everyone was part of the celebration. Evie lost track of time, caught up in the joy of the moment and the pleasure of Aaron's company. She found herself touching him more freely, a hand on his arm as they talked, his arm around her waist as they danced, their bodies moving together in ways that felt both natural and electrifying. "You're a good dancer," Aaron murmured in her ear as they swayed to a slower melody, his breath warm against her skin. "So are you," Evie replied, her heart racing at their proximity. "For an accountant, anyway." His laugh was low and warm. "There's a lot you don't know about accountants." As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin, with only the most dedicated revelers remaining. Evie felt pleasantly exhausted, her body humming with a combination of awareness, music, and desire. "We should probably call it a night," Aaron said, though he made no move to release her from his embrace. "Probably," Evie agreed, but neither of them moved. They stood there for a moment longer, the music fading around them, the torchlight casting shadows across their faces. Then, without conscious decision, they were moving together. First a gentle kiss, then deeper, more urgent, as if they'd been waiting for this moment since they first met. "Which room, yours or mine?" Aaron asked, his voice husky with desire. "Yours," Evie replied, eyes glassy, but without hesitation. The journey back to the resort was a blur of whispered promises and stolen kisses. When they finally reached his suite, the door had barely closed before they were in each other's arms, clothing discarded as they moved toward the bedroom. The night that followed was a revelation, a passionate exploration that stripped away pretense and left only raw emotion and physical connection. In Aaron's arms, Evie felt beautiful and desired, not for the persona she projected, but for the woman she truly was beneath it all.
Spent and satisfied, they lay tangled in the sheets afterward. Evie's senses hovered between sated and safe, a feeling of peace she hadn't experienced in months washing over her. Here, with this man she barely knew but somehow understood, she could be herself, or perhaps someone new entirely. Emory, no, Evie, floated in and out of sleep, wrapped in a heavy, languid warmth. For a few perfect seconds, she didn't have a name or a plan or persona to hold upright. She was simply a woman cocooned in strong arms, her body loose and pleasantly used, her mind quiet in a way it almost never was. Then morning sharpened. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, bright and unforgiving, and Evie's eyes snapped open. Her mouth was dry, her head throbbed, and when she shifted, her body answered with an intimate, unmistakable ache that made heat rush to her face. A rush of images surfaced: torchlight, laughter, his mouth on hers, then dissolved into blank space. The missing pieces hit her like whiplash. She couldn't remember all of it. Not cleanly, not in order, not enough. Mortification flooded her so fast, she almost sat upright, as if distance could undo what had happened. Beside her, Aaron breathed slow and deep, sprawled in sleep with an unguarded softness she had yet to see on him in daylight. One arm was thrown over her waist like a claim he hadn't meant to make. As if sensing her sudden stillness, his lashes fluttered, his eyes opened, bloodshot at the edges, disoriented, and for a beat, he looked at her like he was trying to remember which version of himself belonged in this room. Then his gaze settled on her mouth, her bare shoulder, the tangle of sheets, and something in him steadied, drawn despite the haze. "Morning," he rasped. Evie swallowed hard and tugged the sheet up to her chest, as if fabric could protect her from her own choices. "Hi," she managed, voice thin. Her gaze flicked to the discarded clothes, the half-open closet, the empty glasses on the nightstand, evidence lined up like witnesses. Panic pricked at her skin. What do I say? What do I do? They lay there in a charged quiet, neither quite sure what to do with the dawning day. Aaron dragged a hand down his face, as if he could wipe the fog away. "I don't usually do this," he said finally, the words rough with honesty. "One-night stands, jumping into bed with someone I've just met." Embarrassment, then relief tangled in Evie's chest. Me neither, and it had been true. Since before last night, she'd never jumped into bed with anyone. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself not to bolt. I'm a little freaked out, if I'm being honest. I don't remember everything, just enough to know I wanted what happened, but swallow, meeting his eyes. I don't want this to be something we pretend didn't happen, and I don't want it to be a mistake we repeat just because the night was surreal. Aaron's expression shifted, something like surprise, then respect. "It wasn't a mistake," he said quietly. "At least, it didn't feel like one. But you're right," he exhaled, slow. "We slow down, we act like adults, and if either of us regrets it, we say so now." Evie felt a rush of affection for him. "I don't, and neither do I." Before he could finish his admission, a knock sounded at the door. "Room service?" a cheerful voice called out. Aaron frowned. "I didn't order anything." "Complimentary breakfast for the happy couple," the voice continued, "from the resort management." Evie and Aaron exchanged glances, both puzzled by the unusual service. Aaron threw on a robe to answer the door, while Evie pulled the sheets up to cover herself and followed closely behind. The resort employee who entered was the same one who had served them the previous days, now bearing a tray laden with breakfast foods, coffee, and 2 glasses of a deep ale-colored liquid. "Congratulations on your marriage," Gio said with a broad smile. The resort management wanted to extend their best wishes with a traditional Cypriot breakfast and champagne to celebrate.
Evie felt her heart drop. Marriage? There must be some mistake. "No mistake, madam," Gio replied, his smile unwavering. The entire village is still talking about your participation in the Festival of the Two Kingdoms ceremony last night. Usually, only the locals join in the reenactment, but you and Mr. Stone were the epitome of pledge and promise last night." "I don't understand," Aaron muttered, rubbing his eyes as if that would clear his mind. "What does any of that have to do with a marriage?" "The Festival of the Two Kingdoms is a legally binding wedding ritual under Cypriot law," Gio said, still smiling. "Our elder explained it clearly last night before the vows, but you were celebrating." "Oh my gosh," Evie whispered harshly, her hands clasped over her lips. "Congratulations, you are now legally married under Cypriot law, and don't worry, the marriage is recognized internationally as well." As Gio smiled knowingly at the disheveled pair before them, departing with the breakfast and the unsettling news, Evie felt the room begin to spin. This couldn't be happening. She'd come to Cyprus to escape her life, not to legally bind herself to a man she barely knew, a man who, unbeknownst to her, wasn't even who he claimed to be. Aaron stood silently, his expression unreadable as he processed the information. Evie watched him, suddenly acutely aware that they were essentially strangers who had accidentally gotten married while under the influence of alcohol and whatever else had been in those addictive fruity drinks. "This is unexpected," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Unexpected?" Evie repeated, her shock giving way to hysteria. "Aaron, we're married, legally. That's a little more than unexpected." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of stress. "We can get it annulled, can't we? There was clearly something in the food and drinks we consumed all night. We weren't in our right minds." "I don't know," Evie admitted, her mind racing through the implications. "Even if we can, it still changes everything." What had started as a vacation escape had somehow morphed into a legal complication of enormous proportions. They were married, two strangers pretending to be people they weren't, now bound together by a ritual they hadn't understood. "We need to figure out what to do," Aaron said, his practical nature asserting itself. "First, let's eat something and clear our heads. Then we'll investigate what legal recourse we have." As they picked at the breakfast, both lost in thought, Evie couldn't help but wonder what other surprises this vacation had in store for them. The man beside her, the supposed accountant she'd married, was beginning to seem more than he appeared. Yet she, with her fabricated identity as a marketing consultant and a low tolerance for spiked Cypriot fare, was hardly in a position to judge. The following days passed in a blur of whispered arguments, frantic Googling, and tense phone calls to anyone who might know how to undo a mistake made under torchlight and too sweet wine. The verdict, when it finally came, made Evie's stomach drop all over again. The marriage was legally binding, and while it could be annulled, it would not be quick or clean. In a modest office near the marina, a Cypriot attorney delivered the news with practiced sympathy. "You can file for annulment," she explained, sliding a packet of forms across the desk. "But in this jurisdiction, there is a 6-month waiting period before the court will consider it finalized. It's customary, intended to prevent impulsive dissolutions after ceremonies like the festival." Evie stared at the forms as if they were written in fire. 6 months? She echoed, her voice thin with disbelief. Across from her, Aaron went still, his jaw clenched, then unclenched, like he was forcing himself not to break something. Confusion crossed his face first, then a kind of controlled shock. "So we're married," he said slowly, as if speaking it out loud might make it false. "Not just for the rest of this trip, but for months." They left the office with the packet in Evie's bag and a new kind of silence between them, heavier than embarrassment, sharper than regret. They walked along the sunlit harbor without a plan, both of them too stunned to pretend this was funny. "We can still file," Evie said, more to herself than to him.
We can do everything right. We can start the clock, but we can't fast forward 6 months." Aaron exhaled, long and measured. "Then we stop treating this like a prank we woke up from," he said. "We're here, we're stuck, and we have 2 choices. Spend the rest of the trip miserable, counting days until we're free, or decide that while we're in Cyprus, we do this, deliberately." He glanced at her, expression guarded but steady.
We stay married for the vacation. We learn each other, we set boundaries. We don't make promises about New York or St. Louis or anything after the flight home. We just focus on us, here. Evie should have said no. She should have clutched her dignity like a life raft and rowed herself back to solitary safety. Instead, she heard herself say, "Okay," and the word landed between them like a match struck in a dark, gunpowder-enriched room. Small, bright, dangerous. They agreed on rules over coffee that tasted like cinnamon, honesty about what they wanted in the moment, no digging into family history or long-term plans, no questions that would force either of them to dismantle the identities they'd built to survive. It was cowardice, dressed as one accord, and it was also the first time all week Evie felt her heart splinter. They started walking without a destination, as if movement could keep the situation from swallowing them. The legal appointment had been clinical. Dates, signatures, fees, a polite lecture on consent and intoxication. And the verdict was simple. An annulment was possible, but not instant. Time and bureaucracy stood between them and freedom. The knowledge sat in Evie's chest like a stone. After that, Cyprus changed for them. They did the things married couples did on purpose. Shared breakfasts, argued gently over maps, picked out souvenirs like they meant to remember. Aaron taught her how to snorkel without panicking. Evie dragged him through a tiny bookshop in the old city, delighted when he actually listened to her ramble about rare bindings. At night, the chemistry that started in drunken heat kept finding them. Only now it came infused with laughter, with whispered confession, with the quiet intimacy of learning each other's languid touches and sleep rhythms. They fell hard without noticing they were falling, fast without meaning to. And the closer they got, the more both of them guarded the same secret. Don't ask who I really am. The truth didn't surface until the vacation was nearly over, and when it did, it detonated. It started as a minor inconvenience, a resort billing issue that required identification at the front desk. Evie handed over her passport without thinking, still sleep-soft and smiling from the way Aaron had kissed her in the elevator. The clerk's eyes flicked down. "Dr. Thompson, Emory," she said, cheerful and oblivious. Aaron froze. Not the casual stillness Evie had learned to read as caution, but the kind that meant impact. His gaze locked onto her with a stunned, searching intensity. "Emory," he repeated, softly, like he was trying to match the name to the woman he'd been touching like she was his. "So, Evie is..." Heat rushed up Emory's neck. The lobby suddenly felt too bright, too public. "Emory is my name," she said, voice tight. I didn't plan to keep it from you this long." And even as she said it, she knew that was a lie, because part of her did plan it. The longer she stayed Evie, the longer she got to exist as the woman who deserved what she was being given. They didn't speak again until they were back in his suite, the door shutting behind them with a final, terrible click. "How long?" Aaron demanded, disbelief finally breaking into anger. "How long were you going to let me love you as someone else?" Love? Emory's breath shuddered out of her, sharp with shame. But just as quickly, the shock she'd been holding on to at his Freudian slip collapsed into something quieter and uglier: regret. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tasting like acid. "I didn't expect this to become us. I thought I could keep Evie on like a costume and take her off on the plane." Her eyes glistened. "And then you looked at me like I mattered, and I got scared that if you saw the real me, you'd reconsider." Aaron's face tightened, pain and anger fighting for space. "You made a choice," he said,
voice low and controlled, the kind of control that sounded like judgment. Every day, every time I asked you something real and you answered as Evie, every time we got closer and you let me believe I knew you. He shook his head once, disbelief turning into something sharper. So, who is even Emory Thompson? Aaron asked, voice low and tight. Emory opened her mouth, but nothing came out first, just a thin, shaky breath. The question wasn't even an accusation, it was worse. It was an audit. She pressed a hand to her sternum like she could keep herself from fragmenting. I'm a university librarian, doctorate in information science. I spend my days in archives and reference requests and quiet rooms where nobody looks twice at me unless they need something found. She swallowed, blinking hard. Evie was a mask. My sister helped me build her after my ex humiliated me and convinced me I was invisible unless I performed. Evie Thompson was a marketing consultant because it sounded like the kind of woman men listened to, confident, polished, untouchable. I told myself it didn't count as lying because Cyprus was supposed to be temporary, a place to try on being the woman people don't correct or overlook or trade in for someone shinier. Her lips trembled. And then I met you, and it stopped being a costume and started being a way to not lose you. I got in my own head, forgot my power. I genuinely believed that the bookish, awkward, honest me wouldn't be who you'd want. For a long moment, Aaron didn't say anything. He just stared at her, studying her, as if expecting another unknown revelation to burst forth. Do you understand how this has impeded consent or trust? I fell for you with incomplete information, Emory, and you let that happen. Emory flinched like he'd struck her. Tears spilled before she could stop them, humiliating and hot. I know, she whispered. I know I did, and I hate that I did. She wiped at her cheeks with the heel of her hand, voice cracking. Tell me what you want, what you need me to do to make this right. I'll fix it. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't look at me like a stranger.
As if the universe were determined to immediately level set the conversation, his phone lit up on the nightstand, an incoming call and a push alert arriving all at once. Mitchell Scott's name flashed across the screen. Beneath it, a quick text message with an embedded financial headline scrolled in stark block letters. Mitch. Alex, have you seen this? Strickland Global CEO Alexander Strickland spotted in Cyprus amid board turmoil. Emory's breath hitched. The room tilted. Alexander, she whispered, the name tasting like metal as the headline burned into her vision. You're Alexander, not Aaron Stone. She took a step back, like distance could keep the betrayal from burning through her skin. You just spoke about a lack of disclosure, about consent, she said slowly. You let me beg, she snapped, voice shaking with rage. You let me sit here crying, offering to do anything to earn back your trust, while you were holding a lie that could swallow my whole life. You watched me be vulnerable with you. You had sex with me. You married me. Her laugh broke, sharp and disbelieving. And you didn't think that information mattered? For a long beat, he looked like he might deny it, like denial was a reflex as necessary as breathing. Then his shoulders dropped. Yes, my name is Alexander Strickland, he said quietly. I used Aaron Stone because if I travel as myself, I'm followed, filmed, used, and he swallowed. I needed 3 weeks where my nervous system could stop bracing for impact. The words should have explained everything. Instead, they gutted her. Because now the past 3 weeks replayed in her mind with refined optics and a new soundtrack. The ease with which staff deferred to him, the subtle luxury he pretended not to notice, the way he was calmest when she was in his arms, as if she had been the sedative, not the wine. Emory's apology curdled into fury, fast as it made her dizzy. So I get crucified for an invented first name, while you just stood here claiming to love me under a whole fake identity. Alexander flinched. You weren't a cover story, Evie. Emory, he said. He stopped, jaw working, like the honest word was too dangerous to say. But Emory had already backed away, arms folded over her chest, as if she could hold herself together by force. She was angrier than she had expected to be, and more heartbroken. The intimacy they'd built, the way they'd started talking about tomorrow like it belonged to them, now felt like a hand closing around her throat. "I can't do this," she said. Not after we were married in every way that mattered and are still strangers where it counts." For a moment, they simply stood there in the wreckage of what they'd made, sunlight shining on the water outside, the room too quiet inside. Whatever tenderness had carried them through Cyprus was real, which made the fallout feel unreal, like being punished for believing in something good. Emory wiped her face and went still, choosing distance the way she'd once chosen a persona. Alexander watched her, jaw tight, as if holding back the instinct to bargain. The decision to file became a no-brainer, because there was nothing else to do but put something official around something that had gone off the rails. The waiting period meant the marriage didn't end when they needed it to. It lingered, a legal thread they couldn't cut on demand. 2 days after everything broke, they left the resort in separate car services and boarded separate flights, bruised in places no one could see, returning to the lives they'd been escaping. No one at baggage claim knew they were husband and wife. No one at their jobs were aware of their wedlock, but on paper, in a jurisdiction across an ocean, they were still bound. The flight back to St. Louis felt like waking up with a bruise you didn't remember getting. Emory stared out the window and tried to decide which part hurt more, that she'd lied, that he'd lied, or that the love she swore she wasn't looking for had still found her anyway. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the inconvenient truth settled into her bones. Whatever happened in Cyprus was definitely not staying in Cyprus, not when their marriage was still real, on paper. At home, her apartment looked unchanged. Books, soft lamplight, the familiar comfort of quiet, but Emory wasn't. She tucked the stamped Cyprus forms into a folder and shoved it into the back of a kitchen drawer, like it could stop being true if it stopped being visible. 6 months, a waiting period, a marriage that existed in ink, even if she refused to speak its name. As she unpacked, her recollection of Cyprus manifested like a dream, vivid and intimate, and now distressed at the edges. She caught herself reaching for her wrist as if the woven bracelet were still there. The stamped Cyprus forms were hidden away, not a conclusion, but a countdown. Nothing was officially over. It was simply suspended. Still, she couldn't deny what Cyprus had done to her. Something in Emory had hardened and brightened at the same time, a refusal to shrink herself into anyone's idea of presentable ever again. No more begging to be chosen, no more disguises built from humiliation. If she was going to be loved, it would be as herself, even if that meant being alone for a while. "You're back," her colleague Sarah said the next day at the library, eyeing Emory's new wardrobe and tan with suspicion. "And you look different." "Just needed a vacation," Emory replied, trying to sound casual. "A change of scenery."
But she had changed, and she knew it. The confidence she'd adopted as Evie hadn't completely disappeared, nor had the pleasure she'd taken in her transformation. She found herself dressing with more care, choosing clothes that highlighted her figure rather than hiding it. The thick framed glasses remained, but now they felt like a choice rather than a necessity. Work felt different too. The predictable rhythm of library life now seemed confining rather than comforting. Emory found herself daydreaming about Cyprus, about the vibrant culture and passionate people, about Alexander, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the room. A week after her return, she received a package from Cyprus. Inside was a framed photo of them at the festival, their faces alight with laughter as they danced. There was no note, just the photo and a small box containing one of the Aphrodite's Delights cocktails, now preserved in some kind of resin. Emory felt tears well up as she looked at the photo. They looked so happy, so carefree.
Two people pretending to be someone else and somehow still finding something real. The fact that it ended the way it didn't erase the way it had felt to be wanted without being corrected. That evening, as she sipped a glass of wine and looked at the photo, Emory realized something important. She didn't want to go back to being the old Emory. The librarian who hid behind books and baggy sweaters was no longer enough for her. She wanted more adventure, more passion, more of the woman she'd been in Cyprus. The question was, how to find that woman in her everyday life. The boardroom doors in New York looked the same as they always had. Polished wood, brushed steel, quiet menace. Alexander felt the familiar flare in his chest as he reached for the handle, that irrational surge his therapist called an implicit memory. He paused anyway, just long enough to press 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist and count his pulse down. "I'm not 10, he reminded his body. "I'm not confronted." And yet, for the first time in months, the panic didn't crest. It hovered, then eased. The difference was immediate and unnerving. Cyprus had left him altered, just not in the way he'd expected. His nervous system had been quietest when he'd been most honest, most connected, when he'd been with Evie, Emory. The equation formed with unsettling simplicity. She hadn't cured him, but she'd made him feel safe, and losing her had snapped something into place. Alexander Strickland stood before his board of directors, his expression calm and composed, despite the racing heart he kept hidden beneath his tailored suit. "Welcome back, Alex," the chairman said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We trust your leave was restorative." "Productive," Alexander corrected, voice even. He set his tablet on the table without rushing, measured, deliberate. Rest is a luxury, clarity is a requirement. Around the table, faces stayed politely blank, but the tells were there. A director flipping a pen open and closed like a metronome, another aligning a stack of papers into a precise edge, the general counsel's legal pad already labeled succession in neat block letters, as if the vote were less a possibility than a standing agenda item. As he launched into his presentation, Alexander could feel their attention like a hand at the back of his neck, clinical, weighing. He kept his breathing low, his cadence steady, giving them nothing to hook into. No tremor, no hitch, no proof that the man who blacked out on a boardroom floor still lived under his skin. Cyprus hadn't given him rest. It had given him a different kind of exposure. With Emory, he'd felt something his body had stopped believing was possible, safety without control. And sitting here, surrounded by polished wood and sharpened intent, he understood the other side of that equation with brutal clarity. This room would never be safe for him, not as long as they thought fear made him governable. "I'm proposing changes," he said, letting the words hang just long enough to register as a challenge, not a request, not a pitch, a decision. The slide behind him shifted to a plan that didn't just tweak margins, it rewired priorities. Employee retention as strategy, reputational risk as real cost, long-term sustainability as leverage rather than charity. The board members exchanged glances, quick, coded, practiced. "This is quite a departure from your previous strategy, Alex," one of them said, carefully, the way one would navigate around something fragile. Another didn't bother with careful. "Is this a reaction to your episode?" he asked, emphasizing the euphemism like it was a courtesy. Silence thickened. The pen stopped clicking. Someone's heel tapped once under the table, then stilled. Alexander felt the old reflex, heat in his chest, vision tightening at the edges, waiting for their next move, the gentle language that preceded a forced resignation, a mutual exit, a signature turned into a weapon. At the far end of the table, one director's fingers tightened around his pen at the mention of departure, as if he'd just remembered what had happened to the last man who tried to steer Alexander Strickland by force. "Sometimes a change in perspective is necessary," Alexander replied, thinking of Emory and how she'd challenged his assumptions about success and happiness.
Noted, the chairman said, the word clipped. He glanced, quickly, unwillingly, at the general counsel. The counsel's pen hovered over succession for one beat, then drew a single decisive line through the heading as she turned the page. "We'll table any discussion of interim leadership," she said, tone neutral.
For now. Alexander didn't press his advantage. He didn't have to. The vote that followed landed in his favor, not unanimous, but strong enough to make the room adjust to him again. Chairs shifted, eyes dropped to their packets. The metronome pen went still. Whatever rumors had arrived with him from Cyprus left the room under his control, sealed behind procedure and numbers the way he'd always preferred. After the meeting, alone in his office, Alexander opened the drawer where he'd locked the Cypriot paperwork away. The marriage wasn't dissolved, not yet. A calendar reminder sat on his phone like a dare. 6 months. He should have felt relief that time would take care of it. Instead, he felt a hard, clear resolve. He wasn't done, not with her, and not with the man he'd been when he met her. If he wanted Emory back, he now knew that he'd have to earn her trust without hiding behind money, anonymity, or control. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing his assistant. "Get me on the next flight to St. Louis," he said, "and clear my schedule for the next few days." As he ended the call, Alexander felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't know what would happen when he saw Emory again, but he knew one thing for certain. The man who had gone to Cyprus was not the same man who had returned, and he was determined to find out if the woman he'd left behind in St. Louis felt the same way. Emory looked up from the circulation desk to find a man standing there, his presence immediately commanding her attention despite his casual attire. It took her a moment to recognize him without the tan skin and leisurely sophistication, but there was no mistaking those piercing green eyes or the way they seemed to see right through her. "Alexander," she breathed softly, her heart suddenly racing. "What are you doing here?" he replied, his voice softer than she remembered. "I came to see you, Emory. I hope that's okay." Emory glanced around the library, suddenly aware of their public surroundings. "We should probably talk somewhere more private." She led him to her small office in the back of the library, her mind racing with questions. Alexander followed, and when she closed the door, his gaze flicked to the latch on instinct. He caught himself, exhaled slowly, and let his hand fall back to his side. "Is it okay if we keep this open?" he asked, quieter than before. "Sometimes tight spaces make my body overreact." Emory's expression softened. She crossed to the door and turned the knob until it clicked, then left it slightly ajar. "We can do open, or we can do shut. Just tell me what you need." "I've been thinking about you," he said as soon as she stepped away from the door, his directness catching her off guard. "About us." "Us, Alexander?" Emory questioned, and her voice betrayed her. Too much history to ignore. "We filed for an annulment. We're in a 6-month waiting period. I think that would be the end of us." "Are you sure?" he challenged, stepping closer. "Because it doesn't feel like the end to me. It feels like the beginning." Emory's breath caught in her throat. She'd felt the same way, but admitting it felt dangerous, an invitation to heartbreak when their worlds were so different. "We live in different realities," she said, trying to sound practical. "You're an insanely wealthy CEO. I'm a university librarian. We don't belong together." "Maybe we belong in a new reality," Alexander suggested, his eyes earnest. "One we create together." Before Emory could respond, her office door creaked open and Sarah appeared, eyes wide with the gossipy urgency only a library could produce. "Emory," she whispered, as if the stacks might hear, "there's a man at the front desk asking for you. He says his name is Mark." Emory's stomach tightened. Of course he'd choose today. She looked at Alexander, still in her office, still too present, too intense, and forced her voice steady. "Excuse me for 1 minute," she said. "I need to handle something." She left Alexander in her office and walked to the front desk, pulse thudding. Mark stood there with the same polished smile he wore at faculty mixers, dressed like he planned to be seen. He straightened when he noticed her, eyes sweeping over her with surprise, approval, calculation. "Emory," he said, voice warm like a practiced hug. "You look incredible. I've been trying to reach you. I thought maybe after some time you'd be willing to talk." Emory kept her hands folded in front of her like she was holding herself in place. "What are you doing here, Mark?" she asked. "This is my workplace." He lowered his voice, leaning in as if intimacy could rewrite history. "I messed up," he said. "I got distracted by something shiny and stupid, and I lost the best thing in my life. I've been thinking about you, about what you said, and I realized I don't want a perfect image. I want you. Let me take you to dinner. Let me prove it." For a moment, Emory heard her old self, the only one who would have bloomed at the attention and forgotten the insult underneath. Then she remembered Cyprus, the way she'd taken up space without permission, the way she'd stopped apologizing for being smart, quiet, herself. "No," she said simply, "you don't get to audition for me at work."
Mark's smile tightened. "Is this about that vacation?" he asked, letting the contempt slip in around the edges. "You come back with a tan and a new wardrobe, and suddenly you're dismissing me?" "Emory," Alexander's voice cut in from behind her, calm, but edged with something territorial he didn't bother to disguise. He'd followed at a distance, drawn by instinct and the way her shoulders had gone rigid. Now he stepped to her side, tall enough that Mark's gaze had to tip upward. Mark's eyes flicked over Alexander in a quick appraisal, clothes, posture, confidence, then returned to Emory like she was the prize being negotiated. "And you are?" he asked, his tone sharp, bordering on aggressive. Alexander didn't look at Emory for permission. He looked at Mark, eyes steady. "Someone you're done speaking to," he said. Then, clearly, loud enough that Sarah at the desk and two nearby students paused mid-whisper, he added, "You have nothing more to say to my wife." Silence snapped through the front lobby. Sarah's mouth fell open, Mark's face drained, then flushed, the realization hitting him like a Mack truck. Emory felt her own shock like ice down her spine, not because the word was technically untrue, but because it had been their secret, and Alexander had just thrown it into the air like a grenade. The word wife landed like a rung bell in a quiet room, loud, unavoidable, reverberating off stone and glass and everyone's attention. For one dizzying second, she hated him for saying it, for making a private truth so public. But then she felt something she didn't want to feel at all, a fierce, treacherous warmth at being claimed after years of being treated like she was optional. Her eyes stung. She swallowed hard, forcing breath into her lungs, and turned just enough to meet Alexander's gaze, and warning and a question woven together. "Mark," she said quietly, voice steadying by force, "we're done here." Then, to Sarah and the few lingering eyes, she managed a brittle smile that probably looked like constipation. She touched Alexander's forearm, not a romantic gesture, but a directive. "Come with me," she murmured, and led him back toward her office before her shaking became visible. Once they were within the narrow hallway by her office, Emory let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. "You can't do that," she said, not loud, because she couldn't trust loud. Her hands were trembling, and she curled them into fists at her sides. "You can't just say things like that in public." Alexander's face tightened with immediate regret. "I realized. I overstepped. I saw him leaning in and my instincts went feral, but I'd be lying if I said I was sorry for it." He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "But I shouldn't have outed anything, especially not something you didn't consent to share." Emory nodded once, swallowing around the tightness in her throat. "Thank you for saying that," she managed. Her eyes flicked toward the lobby as if she could still feel everyone's gaze. "And I need you to understand something. A part of me, an embarrassingly honest part, liked hearing it." She looked back at him, expression raw. "But another part of me feels exposed. I guess two things can be true." Something softened in Alexander's eyes. "They can, and I get it," he said quietly. "I can be intense, but I'm trying to be better." "Are you?" She raised a brow. "I am.
Alexander said, his expression softening. "And I came here to ask you something I should have asked before we left Cyprus." He took her hands in his touch sending a familiar thrill through her. "I know we come from different worlds, and I know our relationship started under unusual circumstances, but I also know that in all my years of building companies and closing deals, nothing has felt as real or as right as being with you." Emory's heart began to pound. "Alexander, I'm not asking you to rip up the annulment papers." "Well, I am, but at least not right away," he continued with a wry smile. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to see where this could go, to explore the possibility of a future together despite everything." "What about your company, your board?" Emory asked, though her heart was already leaning toward yes. "I'm making changes, stepping back from some of the more ruthless aspects of the business. I realized in Cyprus that success isn't measured only in profit margins, but in the quality of one's life and relationships." Emory studied him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes and the vulnerability he'd shown her from the beginning. This was the man she'd connected with in Cyprus, not the ruthless CEO, but the thoughtful, passionate man beneath. "Yes," she said simply, the word feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. "Yes, I'm willing to try." Alexander's smile transformed his face, making him look years younger and infinitely more handsome. "Good," he said, then leaned in to kiss her. The kiss was different from their previous encounters, gentler, more meaningful, filled with promise rather than passion alone. As Emory wrapped her arms around him, she felt a sense of rightness, of coming home to a place she hadn't known she was searching for. 6 months later, Emory stood in the foyer of Alexander's Manhattan penthouse, trying to reconcile the luxury surrounding her with the man she'd come to know in Cyprus. "Still overwhelming?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Just a little," Emory admitted, leaning back against him. "I'm more of books and coffee than champagne and caviar kind of girl." "Good thing I love books and coffee too," Alexander murmured in her ear. "And you." Their relationship had developed slowly since his return to New York, with Alexander flying to St. Louis most weekends and Emory occasionally joining him in Manhattan. They were taking their time, building a foundation based on genuine connection rather than the intense chemistry that had brought them together in Cyprus and still simmered undeniably beneath the surface. "Your sister called," Alexander said, changing the subject. "She wants to know if we're coming to dinner next week." Emory smiled at the mention of her younger sister, who had been thrilled and slightly suspicious about Emory's maintained transformation and mysterious new man. "Tell her yes, but warn her not to interrogate you too thoroughly." "I can handle it," Alexander confidently replied. "I've faced down hostile board members whose sole purpose was to leave me penniless. Your sister doesn't scare me." Emory laughed, turning in his arms to face him. "That's what you think. Your board plays checkers, she plays 3D chess." As they stood there, Emory reflected on how much her life had changed. She was still a librarian, but she was also something more. A woman who had found her confidence and wasn't afraid to go after what she wanted. She'd even started a blog about her experiences, encouraging other women to step outside their comfort zones and embrace new adventures. "How are the panic attacks?" she asked gently, noting the slight tension that still appeared around his eyes when he was stressed. "Better," Alexander replied, although his expression suggested there was more to say. "Much better, actually. I haven't had one since we've been together." Emory was surprised at his answer. "Really?" "I think meeting you, being with you, helped me realize what was causing them. The stress of maintaining this image of the ruthless CEO, the pressure to always be in control. It was exhausting. With you, I don't have to pretend. I can just be myself." Emory felt a surge of affection for this complex man who had somehow become central to her life. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. Their relationship wasn't without challenges. The differences in their backgrounds and lifestyles sometimes created friction, and the public attention that came with dating Alexander Strickland took some getting used to. But they were committed to making it work, to finding a middle ground between their two worlds. "I have something for you," Alexander said suddenly, disappearing into his study and returning with a small wrapped box. "What's this?" Emory asked, taking it from him. "Open it and see." Inside was a first edition of Emory's favorite book, Persuasion, beautifully bound and preserved. But what caught her eye was the inscription on the title page. "To Emory, who taught me that the greatest adventures are often found in the most unexpected places. With love, Alexander." Tears welled in Emory's eyes as she traced the words with her finger. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." "I thought you might like it," Alexander replied, clearly pleased by her reaction. "I remember you mentioning it was your favorite." Emory set the book aside carefully, then wrapped her arms around his neck. "I love it, and I love you," she said, the words feeling natural and right. "I love you too," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion as he returned her embrace. As they stood there in the luxurious penthouse, a world away from the Cyprus village where they'd accidentally married, Emory felt a sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together.
1 year after their fateful meeting in Cyprus, Emory stood before the mirror in her wedding dress, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Gone were the thick-framed glasses and comfortable cardigans of her old life. In their place stood a confident woman in an elegant gown, with her natural hair styled to perfection and a smile that reached her eyes. "Ready?" her sister asked, coming up behind her to adjust her veil. "More than ready," Emory replied, her heart filled with anticipation rather than nerves. The wedding was being held at the university where Emory worked, in the beautiful botanical garden that had always been her favorite place on campus. It was a perfect blend of her old life and new world, the librarian marrying the billionaire in a setting that represented both worlds. As she walked down the aisle, Emory's eyes found Alexander's immediately. He stood waiting for her, handsome in a tailored suit that somehow managed to look both powerful and approachable. The love in his eyes took her breath away, reminding her of the first time she'd seen him by the pool in Cyprus. Their journey hadn't been easy. There had been challenges, self-doubt, moments when their different worlds seemed too far apart to bridge, but they'd faced each obstacle together, their connection growing stronger with every test. When they decided to marry for real, not accidentally under Cypriot law, but intentionally, with full knowledge and consent, they'd agreed it would be on their terms, blending their worlds rather than choosing one over the other. "You look beautiful," Alexander whispered as he took her hands, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't look so bad yourself," Emory replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling through her. The ceremony was simple and meaningful, with vows they'd written themselves, promises to support each other's dreams, to respect their differences, and to always find their way back to the connection they'd discovered in Cyprus. As they exchanged rings, simple bands that symbolized their commitment rather than the elaborate bracelets of their accidental marriage, Emory felt tears welling in her eyes. These were tears of joy, of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led her to this moment. Right before the officiant began, Alexander's gaze skimmed the crowd with old automatic precision, exits, distances, faces he didn't know. Emory felt the minute change in him, the way his thumb worried the edge of his ring, the shallow catch of breath. She stepped closer and slid her fingers into his, squeezing once, twice, an agreed signal. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He looked at her, held her eyes,
and the frantic part of him seemed to stand down. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant announced. "You may kiss your bride." Alexander's kiss was gentle and full of promise, a sealing of their new beginning, rather than a passionate encounter like their first time. As they turned to face their guests, a blend of Emory's academic colleagues and Alexander's business associates, plus family and friends from both worlds, Emory felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. The reception that followed was a celebration of their unique journey, a blend of Cypriot traditions and American customs, with meze and champagne, traditional dances, and modern music. Emory watched as Alexander, once described as ruthless and unapproachable, laughed with her colleagues from the library, genuinely engaged in conversation about literature and history. For her part, Emory found herself discussing business strategy with Alexander's board members, surprised by how much she'd learned from him and how confidently she could hold her own in their world. "They're a curious pair," Emory's overheard one of Alexander's executives say to another, "but somehow they work." "They really do," the other replied, and Emory smiled, knowing they were right. As evening fell, Alexander found her standing alone for a moment, watching their guests mingle and celebrate. "Happy?" Alexander asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Beyond happy," Emory replied, leaning back against him. "Did you ever imagine this would happen when we went to Cyprus?" "Not in a million years," Alexander admitted, "but I'm grateful every day that it did." Emory turned in his arms to face him. "Remember when we thought we were so different, from such different worlds?" "I remember," Alexander said with a smile. "I also remember realizing our differences made us stronger, that each of us brought something the other needed." "Like your business acumen and my book smarts?" Emory teased. "Like your heart and my determination, your compassion and my ambition. Together, we make something better than either of us alone." Emory felt tears welling again, this time from the depth of her love for this man who had seen through her disguises to the woman beneath. "I love you, Alexander Strickland." "And I love you, Emory Thompson," he replied, then leaned in to kiss her again. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the people they loved and the worlds they'd bridged, Emory reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them here. The vacation transformation, the accidental marriage, the revelation of their true selves, all of it had led to this moment, to this love that transcended their differences and challenged their assumptions. The bookish librarian and the calculating magnate, two people pretending to be someone else, who have somehow found their true selves in each other. Their beginning was marked by duplicity, but their future would be built on authenticity, love, and the courage to be exactly who they were meant to be.
Your touch was unexpected. Your love is so electric. I'm falling hard. I can't help myself. The cards I play are from the hand you dealt, but I'm not who you see. Although I wanna be, your whole desire shatters me. Forgive my crime, duplicity. You hold me, you know me, believe me, control me. We can be clarity. Forgive my duplicity. Midnight whispers paint our passion, hidden truths in borrowed fashion. Every touch I feel pleasure and pain, possessive growl. You say my name, in your arms is the safest. You know all of my places, the truth unclear, a lie unframed. This masquerade I can't sustain. You hold me, you know me, believe me, control between two worlds we relive in. One we show, one we're concealing. Your eyes search through constructed walls, and I'm terrified you see it all. Yet something deep inside